What's up guys, it's a new sensation, Big Annotation here, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a different style of video, not something that I've really done on the channel before, and what hopefully will become the start to a slightly more consistent series, covering just general basics and fundamentals when it comes to the Dragon Ball Super card game, and I imagine a lot of these could be applied to a wider variety of card games as well, but obviously mostly focusing on Dragon Ball when it comes to these videos. And this is a style of video that I've strayed away from in the past quite a lot. Just because I don't want it to come across as kind of the style of video where I'm telling you that this is the best way to do things or the best way to view the game, or anything like that. And that's why I kind of want to put this almost disclaimer in the start where I'm saying, you know, this video is intended to be much more of a conversational video rather than necessarily like I'm telling you this is the way to do things. It's not. This is just the way that I tend to do things. If you guys have your own different ways of approaching these sorts of fundamentals, then I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your guys' approaches and takes to the games. But these kinds of videos are here to give you guys some tips if you want them. If you don't want them, then that's absolutely fine. If you want to disagree with me on everything, let me know in the comments again, because this video is almost intended for me to learn about how you guys view the game, as well as for you guys to learn about how I view the game. If you guys have absolutely no opinion on this sort of thing, or you have, you know, no idea, for example, today we're doing how to analyze and counter a meta. If you guys have absolutely no idea how to approach this thing, then that's maybe where this video is going to be a bit more informative. And you guys can maybe use this as a basis to then structure how you might take and analyze and counter a meta. So maybe using this more of a basis to build upon your own skills, rather than just taking everything that I say as gospel and running with it, I think is how I'm intending for this to come across. But hopefully that's the way that this ends up going. And yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys think of this style of video, because it is something that I do want to do more often. It just takes a lot more preparation and effort than you know, my standard like gameplays or deck profiles or anything like that, and it also takes a lot more effort within myself to kind of put these videos out there and make sure that they're constructed in a way that I'm actually happy with. But like I say, today we're going to be covering how to analyze and counter a meta, and like I say, this is personally how I tend to look upon metas and try and analyze them in ways that I can pick slightly more off meta decks that might come in and make a wave in specific metas or time periods. If for any of you who may have watched the channel at all recently, then you'll probably know that I tend to enjoy some of the more rogue decks when it comes to different metas. If there's a defined best deck or top any number of decks, they're generally the decks that I'm straying away from and trying to figure out how to counter rather than just playing them. For me, a lot of the fun of this game comes from trying to figure out how to make the decks that you love so much better than the rest of the competition, and trying to tech them and side deck them into ways that can actually take down the competition. And so I tend not to play the best decks, and I think that's why I can have maybe a good output on this sort of video. But enough rambling from me, let's just go ahead and get straight into things. So today, how to analyze and counter a meta. So I guess the first thing to cover would be, what is a meta? And that would be well, meta actually specifically stands for something. A lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this until I was informed by Jamie from Scrub Games, and that is the most effective tactics available. So what does that mean? So it means kind of, I mean, the best decks, it's kind of self-explanatory, but what are the most effective tactics available? What are the most effective tools that you can utilize to achieve a top cut or a win in any case when it comes to a big event like a regionals or bigger even. When it comes to these, there's a lot of different types of metas, but these are kind of the most common ones that I like to think of and kind of orient my thoughts around. That would be the first one being a one deck format, in which I would consider the Crimson meta being a one deck format. It felt like if you were playing in that meta, you were either playing Crimson or you were playing to counter Crimson, and there was no real in between, and if you weren't playing one of those decks, eventually you'd lose to Crimson, and Crimson would then win the event. I mean, I'm trying to orient this as well around much more recent events, so not trying to look back over the past, like, longer than a year, because I feel like there's a lot of examples that we can take upon from the past year that are a lot more fresh in our minds, and also for any newer players who may have only started playing in the past year or so, they won't know a lot of the cards that we're talking about if we're talking about like Super Shenron or anything, you know, old like that. We're not trying to be DBS boomers out here, so we'll try and keep this shit up to date. And then moving on, we've got the 2-deck format. In my eyes, this was kind of when SS4 and Sin was around this time of Set 18's release. These 2 decks were very dominant, taking up ridiculous amounts of top cuts. And also, it's important to note, a lot of this can be kind of determined from just looking at top cut numbers. So if a lot of representation from these decks is kind of cropping up, you can kind of identify what kind of format it might be. And especially across multiple tournaments as well. So a 2-deck format, I would say, is SS4 Gogeta and Sin Shenron. It felt like you were either playing one of those 2 decks, or you were playing a deck that could counter those decks, which is why at the time Gamma was also a very nice pick just specifically to counter those 2 decks. But I wouldn't say Gamma was really on the power level of those 2 decks until the set after, when it got a crazy amount of tools and the defending friends and everything. That's kind of a good example of a 2-deck format. A triangle format, I wasn't really sure of a great example of this. They're a lot harder to identify, I feel like, in Dragon Ball, because I feel like the line blurs quite a lot between triangle formats and open formats. A lot of the time there is not a huge power level between the top decks and kind of the tier 2 or rogue status. And that's why a lot of the time those rogue decks can definitely take events or get a higher representation in top cuts. Just because this game has generally quite good power balancing, which I'm very appreciative of. So triangle formats are a lot harder to identify, I feel like, in this game, because oftentimes if there's 3 decks that are all countering each other, you can often sneak in like other decks, and it starts to blur into an open format. But triangle format is kind of when there's 3 top decks, one of them counters the other, that one counters the next one, and that one then counters the first one. So it kind of goes in a triangle of power like that. And then an open format, which I find to be quite common in Dragon Ball. You can kind of play anything. There's a wide variety of decks to play, and every top cut is kind of going to be unpredictable, which I feel like is kind of what we're going into a bit more now, because whilst Green Gohan is considered, or is getting a lot of representation and considered to be one of the top decks, there's really not that much of a power difference between Green Gohan and the rest of the tier 1 decks, and then between the rest of the tier 1 decks and the tier 2 decks. It feels like there's, a lot of variety in what can top, and I think we've seen that recently in things like Ape Coup winning the LATAM regionals, and Launch, I believe, won the French regionals as well. So there's really a lot of things that can go on right now. So I guess the most recent example of an open format would be what we're in right now with Set 22 on the horizon, but Set 21 fairly recently released. And yeah, that's kind of the different types of formats. I guess going back to the triangle format, the best example of a triangle format that I can think of off the top of my head right now would be kind of around the U7 meta. So there was U7, there was Trunks Gogeta, and there was the Cell reboot that came out. And granted, a lot of decks could compete around that time as well, but I feel like those 3 were the top decks. And it did very much feel like a lot of the time U7 would beat Cell, because the Cell blockers getting minus 20k was, it meant that they couldn't be protected by their permanent. Cell would often beat Trunks Gogeta, I feel like, and then Trunks Gogeta would beat U7, just because it could out-control them. So I feel like that's maybe a slightly older example of a triangle format, but in my eyes that would have been a good triangle format. Again, the line between triangle format and open format is really hard to determine. But when it starts to become more than 2 decks in a format, you're able to kind of pick a much wider variety of decks in this game, I find. So within these metas, there are different shifts between tournaments. And the most basic way to think about this is if one deck is doing really well in a big tournament, then the next tournament might have lots of people trying to counter that deck. And that's especially going to happen when it comes to kind of the wider formats as well. If one specific deck of the triangle format does really well in one tournament, there might be a lot of the deck in the triangle that counters it in the next tournament. And that kind of differs from region to region as well. People might be just more focused on their region, so it can be important just to pay attention to the events just in your region when trying to navigate that sort of thing. But that's kind of where you start to counter a more open meta where the best decks aren't really set in stone from tournament to tournament. Whereas if it's just a 1 deck format, you're likely going to see that same deck just doing really well over and over and over, and so you can safely pick to counter that deck. So that's pretty much a good definition, hopefully a good definition of what a meta is and some examples of them. Going on to the next point, and this is kind of a more brief point that I just want to bring up very quickly, and that is that the best deck isn't always the best deck. And that's a very contradictory statement to say, but what I mean by that is that the best deck, which is the kind of public perceived best deck, isn't always the deck with the highest power level, or the actual best deck. And so what I mean by that, and what I think it's informative to take away from that, is that, for example, in my eyes, I feel like Red Vegito at the moment is the best red deck. Whereas I know a lot of people would say that Red Pan is the best deck. In my eyes, it's always been Red Vegito. And even though, you know, Red Vegito hasn't seen as many results behind it recently as Red Pan does, that can maybe be perceived, or the way I perceive that is that it's because the public perception is that Red Pan is the best red deck, and so that means more people are playing Red Pan, and that then leads to more results with Red Pan. And it can also be the case that Red Vegito maybe isn't fully solved yet, which I think is also partly the case. I think people aren't necessarily on the best builds of Red Vegito at the moment, which is maybe also causing to that effect of Red Vegito performing worse than Red Pan. Another example of that at the moment is that I feel like Black Trunks is the best deck, rather than SS4 Gohan. And maybe that's a bit more of an out there take at the moment, especially with the results that Gohan has been putting out. But again, it can tie into that same thing. If people are perceiving Gohan to be the best deck, more people are going to be playing Gohan, which is then going to lead to more Gohan tops, more Gohan wins, and then more people will believe that Gohan is the best deck. So it's not necessarily always about the power of a deck as to the popularity of a deck almost. And that also can be tied backwards almost. So in my eyes as well, I have to consider, okay, I think Trunks is the best deck, even though Green Gohan is doing this well, but it doesn't matter if I think Trunks is the best deck. If Green Gohan is doing well, Green Gohan is the deck that I should be looking to counter. And so I shouldn't necessarily be looking to counter Trunks right now, or Red Vegito over Pan. I should be looking to counter Pan when it comes to red decks, and Green Gohan when it comes to green decks. Or just Green Gohan overall, because it is the public perceived best deck. It can almost work backwards in that way that, yes, you may think of deck as the best deck, and you may think people are sleeping on this particular deck, but it doesn't matter at the end of the day what you think. If you're looking to counter a meta, you have to take the opinion of the public, and you have to take the opinion of what the masses think. And if the masses think that Green Gohan is the best deck right now, which I can respect that opinion as well, it's a very, very strong deck for sure, then it's the best deck. It doesn't matter what I think right now, I need to be countering Green Gohan. And that is just kind of a general rule that I think is important to keep in mind when it comes to looking at metas. Obviously, going into a good example would be going into the Set 19 Nationals that happened last year, and especially in America where Set 19 was actually legal. People were very much of the opinion going into that meta that Red Sin and Gogeta would still be the best decks. And then a good example of where you can kind of use this is where a lot of people then ended up bringing Crimson and displaying that Crimson was actually the best deck. So if the power level of the best deck in your eyes is a lot higher than the power level of the public perceived best deck, then it can also be worth bringing that best deck in your eyes to a tournament to kind of test that. If it's at a much higher power level, then you can just clean out the competition and you can show that it is the best deck. But it can also be worth, if you're specifically looking to counter the meta rather than just bring a new best deck into the format, then it can just be worth looking to counter what is the public perceived best deck. And hopefully all of that makes sense. But a good example of where people just brought a higher power level deck that was maybe a bit more under the radar was in that Set 19 American Nationals, where everyone was playing Crimson out of completely what felt like completely nowhere, and then half of the top cut is Crimson, all of the top four almost I think was Crimson, and the finals was Crimson versus Crimson, when everyone just assumed that Red Sin and Gogeta would remain the best decks, and Gamma would get some boosts here and there as well. So going on to, I guess, more specific things, and you'll see here some examples on the board, what am I, a school teacher? On the slide here, which we'll cover as well. But I think the main thing to look out for when it comes to how to counter the meta, or how to just look at the meta as a whole, is looking at different cards, decks, or interactions that warp the format. And so what do I say when I mean a card, deck, or interaction that warps the format? By that I mean the term warping the format is not being sent to the area in the Dragon Ball Super card game, the warp, but actually deck, card, or interaction that you need to be able to beat or have an answer to in order to compete in that current meta. So there's a lot of examples of this, but most formats have these, but they're kind of to varying degrees of overbearingness on the format. And it's important to look, when looking to counter these warping cards or decks, to pinpoint the points that they can be prevented, finding cards that can do this, and then finding the best decks from there that can then abuse these cards. So if you're looking to specifically counter a format, you want to find a card or interaction that can counter this warping deck card or interaction, and then find from there the deck that can abuse that interaction the most or to the fullest potential. And this is kind of easiest done in a one deck format, such as the Crimson format, because you only have one deck to think about. You don't have to think about any other deck. In Crimson format, it was just Crimson. And so you think about Crimson, you think, can this deck, can this interaction beat Crimson? And then you kind of go from there. And so you either played Crimson or you played a deck or strategy that would beat Crimson. And Crimson's strength was the defense that the Awaken side provided, as well as the draw 3 on Awaken and the abuse of restanding the leader with Beast Gohan for some really silly turns to just untap loads of energy and very easily kill a lot of opponents. And the best way to prevent this was to stall their Awaken for as long as possible, as the front side didn't offer nearly as much value, and although they could take their own life with the front side skill, it was at activate battle timing, and so by playing decks with lots of negates that were ideally searchable, as well as decks that could either play a lot of negates or draw without attacking their leader, to kind of prevent the Awaken for as long as possible, ended up being the decks that were very strong against it. And so you can see that in decks like Gamma, where they have a lot of searchable negates. They have just a lot of negates in engine, as well as like generally playing a lot of negates, so the deck was naturally built quite well to stall out Crimson's Awaken. And you can also see it in decks like Golden Frieza, again a deck that naturally plays quite a lot of negates, but in this kind of Crimson format you'd probably tech in quite a few more negates to guarantee that they don't get their Awaken off early. And also that deck specifically could also draw cards whilst not attacking, just off of the leader activate main skills. That was a lot of what the decks in that format would be aiming to do, would be to either draw without attacking or have a lot of negates that were ideally searchable or in archetype negates that you would play normally, just so that if you played against decks that weren't Crimson, or if you played against other Crimson counters, you could still function as an actual deck. Because it's very important in this one deck format, if you're playing a deck that only ever wins against the one deck, if you start playing against counter matchups for that same deck, that are just generally better built decks than yours, it's gonna fall apart. Well, I'll get into an example of that in a little bit, hopefully. But going back to the Crimson example, you could stall their Awaken for as long as possible, and that was very, very strong against it. But then you did also need a finisher, so then being able to drop some big game-winning bombs at the end to finish was kind of the best way to counter this deck. And you saw that again with Gamma, with the Turning the Tide, just dropping a broken card like that, or in yellow, dropping the 7-drop Emperor Frieza was, again, a very strong counter to this deck, because you could stall to this late game point. Dropping cards that would then just win on their own was kind of very important, just as a way to finish the game and guarantee that win against Crimson. And another way to stall their Awaken, especially, this is all kind of considering post-errata. I feel like pre-errata on Crimson, it was very tricky to kind of do anything against that deck, to be honest. But post-errata on Crimson, another way to stall their Awaken was to prevent them from getting to the 5 Saiyans in the drop by using any sort of drop manipulation. And this is again where the Turning the Tide came in as very helpfully as a endgame bomb, because not only did it reset their hand, but it also reset their drop. And so then if you had a big board built up, you could just kind of kill from there. An example of a deck where it is specifically built just to counter the top deck, in my eyes, would have been Mechikabura, or a similar sort of drop area manipulation oriented deck like Mechikabura in the Crimson format, because you can see obviously Crimson or Mechikabura would have in theory done very well against Crimson, just because it can warp a lot of the Saiyans. So if they're putting Saiyans into the drop one by one, it can, you know, warp those out as they go into the drop. And so that's obviously in theory a great counter at that time, but you also have to consider that Mechikabura at the time was not a very good deck. It didn't have a lot of the set 21, well, it didn't have any of the set 21 support. It was a fine deck, but it wasn't a good deck. So if you played against decks that were built to counter Crimson, that were still very functional in their own shell, such as Gamma or Golden Frieza, like we already mentioned, then the deck would start to fall apart. And especially once you start to lose those early rounds in a tournament, if you play against you know, in the early rounds, you're much more likely to play against non-meta decks. And so if you start to lose those early rounds in the tournament, you'll start to play against less and less Crimson, because in theory, the Crimson decks are doing well at the time. If they lose the early rounds because they don't pair against Crimson, they'll be more likely to pair against non-Crimson decks, and then they'll just continue to lose. So it can be very risky picking that sort of strategy. But then also going specifically back to the Mechikabura example against Crimson, it ended up turning out that the drop area manipulation strategy to kind of prevent them from getting to the 5 Saiyans wasn't as consistent as initially expected, because even if they have 0 Saiyans in drop at the time, they can just combo 5 Saiyans to awaken if they needed to, and just because of the inherent power difference between Crimson and the rest of the decks, once it got to that awaken side, it didn't really matter if they just comboed 5 cards, because they could just replenish it off of the awaken side's value, or just dropping Beast Gohan to win the game. And there's also the mechanic of Z-charging, which was introduced a set before that time. Even if you're playing a deck with lots of drop area manipulation, at the time you could just Z-charge the Saiyans and then play a Z-battle card, combo the remaining Saiyans you need, get to 5, and then you can awaken anyways. So drop area manipulation ended up not being the most consistent answer to Crimson, and the most consistent answer ended up being kind of playing lots of negates, ideally in archetype negates as well, so that they were preferably searchable or had some sort of synergy, and then playing big bombs to just end the game. Another good example of decks or interactions that would warp the format, in my eyes, was the SS4 Gogeta deck, because SS4 Gogeta had kind of 2 warping interactions in my eyes that caused the deck to be insanely strong, especially in the early stages of the Zenkai block, and then again after Crimson was banned. And those 2 interactions being just the 8-drop being completely insane, the fact that it could clear a board and deal damage to the leader, or send an attack to the leader, which would then create a lot of hand destruction because you'd have to combo out. There was no way to negate the attack or anything like that. So it acted as board removal and hand control in one card, whilst not really costing the SS4 player anything. And then there was also the problem of the interaction with the fact that the Unison was so strong in the deck, and the Unison would create lots of free draw power on the SS4 players' turns, because of the fact that the 4-drops would draw on play and then draw on combo, and they were reduced to 1 costs, so the SS4 Unison could then play them, draw a card, and then combo them to draw a card, and it would be a free just draw 2. And not only that, but it would also generate free Z energy, which would then lead to the interaction with Rush Attack Vegeta, so that on turns where they didn't need to use the 8-drop, they could pressure with Rush Attack Vegeta with no cost to their hand size at all, but also being able to remove the board again whilst also pressuring the leader for, again, no cost to their hand size. So these 2 interactions in my mind were always the reasons why SS4 was so strong. Was first of all the Unison creating or allowing for so much free draw power and Z energy manipulation to be generated, because whilst the leader backside auto on attack did let you generate that free draw power and Z energy in the same manner, it required the leader to attack. It had a bit more interaction, but it also, you know, it's the fact that they were able to do that twice per turn that was so scary. Being able to do it once per turn was less strong, and so oftentimes if you removed the SS4 Unison, they'd have to then spend another turn to re-establish that Unison. So going to the 8-drop, the 8-drop was incredibly hard to interact with due to the permanent, but for example, the way that I would look at countering SS4, and obviously it's, again, I want to preface this all by saying it's a lot easier to look at this stuff in hindsight, but I'm just trying to give examples of these sorts of things so that you can kind of get into that idea on how I'm thinking about these metas at the time as well. But I understand it's a lot easier to be saying all of this stuff in hindsight when we've already seen these metas develop and everything. But when it comes to the 8-drop and the SS4 in general, the 8-drop was very hard to interact with due to its permanent. You couldn't interact with it once it was on the board, and you couldn't interact with it during attack. However, that kind of meant that there were 2 different ways that you needed to interact with it. And the first being any sort of counterplays, so any counterplays that would apply a lingering effect that wouldn't affect the card specifically, but that would then either prevent it from doing what it wanted to do or mitigate the losses that you might receive. And the other way that you could prevent it from entering play was, or mitigate the card existing was to prevent it from entering play entirely. Now, in terms of counterplays, unfortunately the card had Deflect as well, so there was no real way to stop it coming into play from a counterplay. But any sort of lingering effects were very, very strong against it. And so initially I feel like a lot of people moved to blue as a good counter to SS4, because blue has access to Dirty Bursts, or had access to Dirty Burst pre-ban list, which was at the time the best way to kind of deal with the 8-drop, because it would force them to play the 8-drop, so they'd still have to tap 4 energy for it, but you would just simply tap 2 in response, deny the 8-drop from attacking at all that turn by the lingering effect of Dirty Burst, and then they'd still invested their 8-drop into it, but you'd only paid 2 energy, not lost any hand size, and then they'd had to pay 4 energy, so it was a big plus in terms of the blue player's part. And then not only that, but blue also has obviously a lot of access to untapping, so their energy is much less kind of valuable than a red player's energy might be. And so that meant that they could make use of Black Smoke as well, kind of going into set 19, because paying 2 energy to remove the SS4 Unison, even though it was 2 energy for 2 energy, and technically the SS4 player had got more value off of it because they'd had a turn to use their +1 or +2 skill and get the draw power off of the 4-drops. Because blue doesn't care about its energy as much, trading that 2 energy for 2 energy is fine because you're stalling out the game longer and you're going into the later stages of the game where blue is a much stronger color generally than red is. And so that's why I feel like a lot of people initially gravitated to blue. Yellow players, from what I generally saw around the time, started to play, or at least sideboard, the slug package, so playing Super Namekian and then sometimes playing the 1-drop to bring out the Super Namekian for cheaper. And this was especially important against SS4 because not only did it prevent the 8-drop from coming down in its entirety, because the Union Fusion cost was to draw a card, and so you couldn't pay the cost, you couldn't play the card, but it also mitigated a lot of the draw power from the deck. So again, it's kind of covering those 2 points where the deck was warping the format, the first being the 8-drop, and the second being the ridiculous draw power that the Unison would then provide, combined with the archetype. So it covered both those bases there, but then in response there were people obviously siding barrier removal in the SS4 Gogeta deck, or sometimes mainboarding it, and that meant the slug became a much weaker way to counter the deck. And that's kind of another thing to keep in note, is that a lot of the time these shifts in metas occur because people figure out the counter to the best deck, and then the best deck players figure out the counter to the counter, and it just kind of goes back and forth between there until one deck comes out on top, generally just based off who runs out of counters first or which deck has the highest power level. But going back to the example with SS4, yellow gained the Vegito counterplay in, I believe, set 19 as well. Yellow became a much stronger color in the meta overall, and it was solely down to being able to compete with SS4 a lot more consistently, and being able to not just compete against SS4 but beat it quite consistently, because the Vegito counterplay, whilst it didn't stop the 8-drop from attacking at all, what they could do is play it on a turn where they would play the 8-drop, and it meant that effectively the 8-drop would be limited to around 1 or 2 attacks for that turn. And a big weakness of yellow into the SS4 matchup was that yellow's board had no way to survive against the 8-drop. Yellow is a color that often very much relies on developing and stabilizing a board across multiple turns, backing it up with floodgates or barrier as protection, and then being able to go for a kill turn with an already established board. The 8-drop Gogeta just kind of destroyed that entire game plan. So whilst Vegito didn't necessarily stop the 8-drop, it only mitigated it to maybe 1 or 2 swings a turn. It meant that they wouldn't be losing their entire board as well as their hand size, and so it meant that if the 8-drop swung at leader, you could then use the Gohan Piccolo secret rare to combo out, and you would save yourself, you'd buy yourself a turn against Gogeta, which was huge. And if they went at your board, they could only take out maybe the biggest 1 or 2 threats. So Vegito was a very strong counterplay when it came to dealing with the SS4 matchup. And then moving on to, I guess, more current times, I guess the most prominent card or interaction at the moment that is warping the format would be this 8-drop Goku Gohan, which you can see on the screen. Although I would definitely argue that it's to a much lesser extent than you know, any of the previous examples like SS4 or Crimson, because you can very much still play decks that can't deal with this card and play them to success, just because the card in the deck is not as overbearing as either of the two decks before it. And like I say as well, the format is much more open just because of, as a result of this, there are a lot wider decks that you can play, and so that means there are a lot wider decks that you can play against. So it's not necessarily guaranteed that you'll play against Green Gohan. Whilst it is a very popular deck at the moment, it's not guaranteed that you'll play against it, whereas it might be in a more one deck or two deck format. And so that means you can definitely get away with playing decks that maybe can't deal with this card or the deck as a whole so much. Although going back to just generally countering the meta, if a deck is the most played deck, that is probably the deck that you want to be looking to counter at the moment, or at least the most played deck and the most consistently getting results deck, I'd say. Kind of moving along with the Gohan example there, sort of looking at ways to counter the 8-drop at the moment. And lots of decks, as you might have seen in some of the more recent top cuts, would be packing cards like Mutaito or Petrification, or even cards like Bigger More to deal with this card. And some of the best decks to counter Gohan will be the best decks that can abuse these styles of cards. I guess another example as well of kind of interactions that warp the format. This is a much more general one, and I wouldn't argue that it warps the format nearly as much, but it is something to keep in mind, because I would still argue it's an example of warping the format, is just general floodgates. And we've got Riposte on the board to I guess, represent the floodgates as a whole. And you'll often hear the term kind of floodgate meta or not floodgate meta flying around. And that kind of dictates when you should be preparing for floodgates in the meta and when you shouldn't. A lot of the time you do have to consider if there are lots of floodgates in the meta, and a big example of this was when Gamma was around in the later stages, because you'd have to consider both Gamma's floodgates and yellow floodgates. It did very much feel like at the time you had to make sure you had counterplays for those floodgates, or else you could not compete at the time against those decks, because they could just stall the game too long and then use their engines to generate too much value, or just win in time, which is a lot more of or a lot less fun of a way to win, but it is unfortunately a way that some people will win. But yeah, floodgates are a good example of cards that can end up warping the format in a way, especially if they're used widely or just used in a very strong deck at the time. And going back to the Goku Gohan example, so people are obviously using Mutaito, Petrification, Bigger More, and just generally as well, these cards become especially good when they're counters to these strong interactions or cards in the meta, when they're used in decks that can abuse them very well. And the way that you can kind of look for that is if they initially already have some inherent synergy. So going back to the Gamma or the Golden Frieza examples when playing in the Crimson meta, a lot of the floodgates in Gamma were searchable because they were androids, and a lot of specifically Riposte in Golden Frieza is obviously a Frieza's army, so it has inherent synergy with the leader because you can use it as a floodgate or a negate, and then next turn use it for the leader's skills conditions. So looking at those inherent synergies are very important, or as well if they happen to have a wider utility outside of just the deck or decks that you're trying to counter. So for example, counterplays for floodgates, you would be initially looking to, in the time where Gamma was very strong as well as yellow, you would obviously be looking to counterplay a lot of the Gamma floodgates, but then you could also factor in that yellow was playing just general floodgates as well with Riposte and the Vegito. But also it's very strong to have these counterplays early if you happen to play against a deck that relies on an early Z battle card hitting the board. For example, Blue Beerus at the time was also a contender, and so you could use the counterplays if they were live early to prevent the Whis from landing on turn 2 and prevent them from getting that early ramp. So it's very important to kind of look at a counter or a card that you're using to counter a specific interaction or deck, and then kind of apply it to the wider meta as well. And obviously this is again much harder to do in a more one deck format because you'll just be looking at that one deck. But when it comes to these wider formats and the more open formats, you can really start to look at your sideboard or your main board techs and consider actually the number of decks that the cards might affect and see if there's maybe a better counter to the specific deck that you're trying to counter or the interaction you're trying to counter that can be used more widely. So again, going back to that counterplay example, You might be wanting to use a card like Absolute Release Ball against Floodgates, because in a nutshell, it is better against Floodgates, because you can use it and then untap an energy, so effectively it costs 0. And if you're using it in a blue-green deck, or a deck that charges blue-green energy, you can even take a life for it. However, that card is not as widely usable as a card like Desperate Measures. So looking again at the example against Floodgates, Absolute Release Ball would not be able to stop the Beerus ramp on turn 2, whereas Desperate Measures can. And that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to looking at different options to counter decks or interactions, is where they're more widely applicable. And that will often determine the flexibility of a card and determine which card you might want to use to counter that specific interaction. And I guess the next point that I wanted to make as well would be not necessarily looking at interactions or cards or even decks that warp the format inherently just because they have like 1 or 2 very, very strong cards, but just looking at a deck that has a very strong engine and looking at how that interacts with the format as well. So I think the best example, and again another recent example of this, would be the Red Sin Shenron deck. And you may notice I didn't really bring up Red Sin Shenron in the previous point, because I didn't feel like it had any specific 1 or 2 cards that were breaking the format or warping the format. Whilst it was definitely a deck that was very strong in those times and it would warp the format as well, it wasn't, in my eyes, to the level of SS4 Gogeta or definitely a Crimson at the time, but it did definitely have an effect on the format, and it's very important to kind of keep this in mind. And why do I feel like it had an effect on the format if it didn't have any specific cards or interactions that really warped itself? And that's kind of where I want to bring the point to this one, being looking at telegraphed playlines and turns. So another way that you can kind of pick to counter a specific deck is by looking at a deck's optimal turn by turns, to see what the deck would be, to see what decks would be best suited to dealing with them. Now, some decks won't have as linear turn by turns. For example, Crimson didn't really have like a specific turn by turn playline that it wanted to play by. And even SS4 Gogeta didn't really, other than just playing the Unison on turn 2. Past that, there was a lot of different options that both decks could go for. And generally, just going into the later stages of the game, there are obviously going to be a lot more different options that a deck can play by, because you have more energy and therefore more options. But when it comes to these much more linear decks, generally the more tied to an archetype a deck is, the easier it is to predict its turns. And that's just because the deck will have to pack specifically these cards, or the archetypes cards, and there's only a certain room that they have available for tech choices or to change their turn by turns. Whereas a more generic deck like Crimson or Soul Striker, or any of the kind of generic yellow decks as well that play, they have a much wider range of cards that they can pack, because they're not tied to any specific one archetype, or their archetype is very, very small. Now, even in those small archetypes, or even in those generic decks, there will be ideal turns that they want to play by early on, but they can be a lot harder to predict, because they can differ between each person's list. So I guess that's an important thing to note, is that oftentimes when it comes to predicting a telegraphed playline or a telegraphed turn, it's important to keep in mind how archetypal the deck is. And that's why I feel like Red Sin is a really good example of this, because it was a very overbearing deck, but it didn't have any specifically broken cards. It just had a very strong, reliable engine, and so all of the cards kind of came together to create this broken deck. It was also very archetypal. You had to play a lot of the archetype for the deck to be as strong as it was, and for the deck to work as it did. And that's kind of where you can then consider what the optimal turn by turns were. And so prior to any nerfs, it would aim to play the 4-drop on turn 2 and attack, and then give it critical with the Haze Shenron, and then oftentimes they'd play that alongside either a Unison, a Nuova Shenron, or a Rush Attack if they had the spare Z energy. And so those are that's kind of the optimal turn 2, I'd argue, for Sin Shenron at the time. And then going into turn 3, it would then aim to play the 8-drop and then give it barrier with the Oceana Shenron, and use that as a way to then pressure with Triple Strike, whilst also controlling the board with the Activate Battle on both players' turns. And so this meant if you could stop the main plays of the deck before they kind of connected, a deck like Sin Shenron becomes a lot more manageable. And so that meant that decks that could run early counterplays for the 4-drop, such as Charismatic Villain or the Android 18 Let the Battle Begin, became very strong as counters to Sin Shenron. And as well as any sort of interaction with 2-drops during the opponent's turn, because you want to be able to remove the Nuova as soon as possible to reduce draw power. You want to be able to remove Rush Attack in the case where they swing with Rush Attack before giving it Barrier, because they might not have enough Z energy at the time, or they might just be going greedy, going for that greedy play to try and get the extra removal and damage through. Interactions to kill 2 costs on the opponent's turn became a lot more popular, so cards like Shocking Deathball became played over token negates. Dormant Potential was a very nice floodgate at the time to reduce the pressure in those early turns, as well as removing some of the 2-drops on the board. And Dormant Potential and Shocking Deathball were a very nice pair at the time, because it meant that if they swang with a 2-drop first, you could kill it and then reduce them to 1 attack for that turn with Dormant. Whereas if they swung with their bigger guy first, maybe the 4-drop, whilst having the Nuova on board, you could negate the attack of the 4-drop and then pop the 2-drop. So it became a very nice pair that you could fork the opponent into, and it meant that they had to make a very tough decision when it came to playing against a deck that could pack both those cards. And another great example of a card that would remove the 2-drops on the opponent's turns was the blue Realm of the Gods at the time. Because again, that would give you power on the initial swing whilst also being able to remove another 2-drop. So again, it kind of meant that people were then incentivized to attack with the 2-drops first rather than the 4-drops, which generally they might not want to do. And especially if they have the 2-drops on board that are specifically there to give either Barrier or Critical, so the Haze or the Oceanus, because those cards aren't really going to be attacking anyways. And another way that you could kind of mitigate those early turns was by, again, having easily accessible negates, so ideally searchable negates, just to prevent that 4-drop from attacking with crit, and then being able to remove the board consistently on your own turn. But that was a lot less consistent to achieve and a lot trickier to get to, because that often required multiple pieces rather than just the 1 or 2 cards to deal with it on the opponent's turn. And then again, if you could play a deck with solid barrier removal to go into their turn 3 and deal with the 8-drop, or ways to gain advantage by not attacking so that your board wouldn't get picked apart by his Activate Battle on your turn, and then making sure that you can negate the 8-drops attacks consistently so that you're not taking triple strikes to the face, then it would neutralize a lot of the main engine of Red Sin. And that's kind of something important that I feel like it is very important to note when it comes to looking at these much more linear decks or much more archetypal decks as well. Trying to see, if I were to play against this deck, what would be their optimal turn 2, turn 3 play. And going from there and seeing, okay, what decks can deal with that the best, and do those decks stand a chance in this current format. And I feel like that's a very strong way to look at countering the meta. And I guess going into my last point, and this is a point that I thought would be definitely worth covering, although it may not apply to myself personally so much, it is definitely one that should be applying to everybody, I feel like. And that is just, what if I want to play the best deck? Well, if you want to play the best deck, absolutely go for it. Playing the best deck is arguably the best strategy to do well in a tournament, so I absolutely don't blame you for that. Whilst it doesn't align with how I enjoy the game, I understand that, you know, people want to do well in these tournaments, and playing the best deck is going to give you the most consistent results because the deck gives you the best chance at winning any given game. However, you can still apply these tips when it comes to playing the best deck though. And the first thing to do would be obviously preparing for the mirror match, because if you are playing the best deck, you have to expect a lot of people to be also playing that best deck, if it's the best deck by popularity standards especially. So preparing for the mirror match is going to be super important, and making sure that you test that mirror match a lot so that you have appropriate side and main board techs used or included in your deck, just by using the logic that we applied earlier to countering the meta warping cards in decks. So what that means is kind of applying that logic to when you're playing the best deck. And by that I mean, if you were to play a mirror match of the best deck, at the time, you'd want to make sure that you had your own colors specific answers to that deck. So for example, if I'm playing Green Gohan, I might want to consider including Bigger More, because it can stop the meta warping card at the moment, being the 8-drop Goku Gohan, from attacking, as well as a lot of the other cards in the Green Gohan deck, so the Kaioken Goku, as well as any sort of secret rare they might play on me. But also Bigger More specifically has a lot more utility outside of just the Green Gohan matchup. You can play it against Red Vegito and it does work. You can play it against Black Trunks and it does work. You can play it against a lot of different decks. So whilst on paper it's not a very good card, because it can counter so many of the good decks at the moment, as well as being able to deal with that one specific meta warping interaction, it's a very good inclusion when playing a deck like Green Gohan. And especially if you want to play the best deck, like I say, this is a great example of playing the best deck and preparing for the mirror match. The second thing to do would be to put yourself in the perspective of the people who are looking to counter you. This kind of goes into two separate points. So the first one is to prepare for the cards that people will side in against you by applying this logic that I've been speaking about backwards. So for example, again, taking the current meta, people are playing Green Gohan. Say I want to play Green Gohan again, but I'm concerned that people will start sideboarding against me. So I need to be looking at the cards that people are going to sideboard against me. So that's the card we've mentioned. Bigger More, Mutaito, and the Petrification are going to be the main three examples, I'd argue. And so what can I think about when it comes to those cards? Well, Bigger More is pretty impossible to interact with. They do have to pay 2 energy for it. So if I'm expecting to see a lot of green decks, maybe a lot of mirror matches, maybe I consider building my deck to be a bit more low to the ground, so that if they play Bigger More on me, I can then, push through with a lot more attacks, and Bigger More is less effective against me. Or maybe even if I see that, especially in a best of 3 format, if I see that my opponent is siding Bigger More in maybe game 2, or even if they're mainboarding it in game 1, I can start siding out the 8 drops and siding in more options to deal with their deck. And then going on to, if I'm expecting to play against a lot of yellow decks while I'm playing Green Gohan, they're going to be playing Mutaito. So the best way to deal with Mutaito is to counterplay, because the vulnerability of that card is that it is a battle card that needs to come into play for its effect to trigger. Now you can argue with Green Gohan, they have the 4-drop counterplay, which, because you're the turn player, when Mutaito would be played, you can play your 8-drop, they respond with Mutaito, you can then follow it up with the 4-drop to put the Mutaito in Z energy before its auto can resolve, which is a great answer to it. However, there's a few issues with that, the first being that the 4-drop is much more situational as a counterplay, because you effectively need your Z leader to be already on board for it to be worth it. Which is definitely something that you can set up when playing that sort of matchup, but again, it's another step of setup that you need to be able to get through. But past that as well, if yellow then has a counterplay for the 4-drop to negate its skills, you've invested 3 energy rather than just the 2 energy for the 8-drop that you'd normally invest, and then the same result has happened. And yellow decks, a lot of them are packing cards like Tyrannical Blow or Cold Bloodlust in the Freezer decks, and we do have quite a few strong yellow Freezer decks at the moment in Freezer Swap and Golden Freezer, so it is very important to look out for kind of what your opponent can do to counter your counters almost. So it does become a big train of countering upon countering upon countering, but it's very important to look at that. And so in the example of Mutaito versus the Green Gohan matchup, I'd consider maybe even sideboarding some extra cards that counterplay so that they're a lot harder to interact with. Because the only way that the yellow player would really be able to interact with that is with Cooler Counter, and at that point they're tapping 4 energy for your 3 energy investment on defense. Then you can continue to play your turn out. They'll have had to leave a lot of energy open to do that, and if they've left exactly 4 energy open, they're going to be tapped out, and you should be able to pressure them a lot because of that. So looking into siding an extra card to deal with the Mutaito as a counterplay is a very good strategy when it comes to if you wanted to play Green Gohan this format. And so again, it's kind of looking at the weaknesses and putting yourselves in the perspective of your opponent and thinking, okay, if I was playing against Green Gohan with this particular deck, what would I side in? And then kind of looking at the weaknesses of what they might side in, and then being able to build your deck around that. And especially in a very flexible deck like Green Gohan, which doesn't have a huge engine, it's a very, very wise thing to consider. And then going into the last example is Petrification. Petrification, again, is a really hard one to play around, because the weakness of Bigger More is that you have to do it prematurely. So then your opponent can then set up their turn to just not play the 8-drop, and then they didn't really lose anything, whilst their turn might have been slightly weaker. Weakness of Mutaito is that it can be interacted by counterplays. With Petrification, it is both reactionary, so they have to play the 8-drop for you to be then forced to drop Petrification. You don't have to drop Petrification before they play the 8-drop. And on top of that, it is hard to interact with because it is an extra card. And extra cards naturally are just a lot harder to interact with than battle cards. The main way to kind of counter this, again, another way would just be to play around it, and that's another important thing to note when it comes to putting yourself in your opponent's perspective, is that it puts you in that mindset of being able to play around these answers a lot more and build your deck to play around these answers a lot more. So if you see that you're playing against a black deck and they leave one energy open, you can go much more low to the ground with cards that you wouldn't mind getting hit with Petrification, and then trying to force them to tap that one energy. If they don't tap it, that's fine. They floated an energy for the turn, and if they do tap it, then you can play the 8-drop and punish them with the 8-drop swing. But again, if they don't tap it, you just don't need to play the 8-drop. You can continue going low to the ground and then try and leave it at a point where you've applied a lot of pressure, but they haven't had to invest that, or they haven't invested that energy yet. Is a really good idea, because then they lose an energy that they could have used throughout that turn, or even offensively on your turn, but they just lost an energy for the fact that they have to play around this one particular card, which is again a great example of how a card warps a format or even a game. And you've been able to apply a lot of pressure to them, and then you've left some good amount of energy up for defense as well. So it's about also considering, in the example of Petrification, if you ever tap under 2 energy, they know that you're not going to drop the 8-drop. So it's about leaving that 2 energy open for as long as possible, so that they're forced to leave their 1 energy open for Petrification. And then as soon as you've applied as much pressure as possible, you can consider tapping under 2 energy to get some value. Because again, if you're attacking with them past tapping under 2 energy, they can then use that 1 energy for defense, so it's not going to be as effective. Or you can just leave your 2 energy open for your own defense. And that's where that kind of back and forth of mind games in a game really comes down to it. And again, going back to that Petrification example, the only way you can interact with it is a counter-counter. Now, if in the example where you're playing Green Gohan, obviously Green doesn't really have access to counter-counters, unfortunately. But there are 2 cards, or there is 1 card, sorry, that you can consider. There is not 2 cards that you can consider. There is 1 card that you can consider playing, which would counter that. And that is the Majin Buu secret rare, which is the 3 energy counter for green. Obviously, this is a very drastic change to a deck because it is a secret rare, so it is specifically it means you're not going to be able to play the other very strong secret rares in the game at the time. But again, if you're expecting to play a lot of black decks when you're playing Green Gohan, or you're concerned about what Petrification might do to your deck because you don't want to or you're not able to or don't want to build your deck in a way that can optionally play around it if you're playing against a black deck, then you can play the Majin Buu secret rare. Now, this kind of strategy, because it is specifically a secret rare choice, is a lot more powerful in best of 1. If your opponent sees it in game 1 of a best of 3, then they're just going to know to play around it and aim to kill you before you can get the 8-drop plus Majin Buu combo off on turn 5, or they're going to be playing around it a lot more by preparing for it as well, by maybe playing more preventative cards such as Mechikabura the Broken Seal, which would prevent the 8-drop from coming down entirely. But yeah, they'll be able to look into starting to play around that. So specifically, that strategy around a secret rare is going to be a lot more effective in a best of 1 scenario, but it's just a really general notion that I think is very important when it comes to putting yourself in your opponent's perspective, and then being able to see from that how you could counter their counters to your very, very broken card. And that's kind of all of the points that I had. I guess the last thing to say is, if you're again looking to play the best deck, obviously if they have any specific counter matchups, then looking to test against them is a great idea as well. But that's kind of just a general thing. I imagine that everyone who is aiming to play the best deck, who is putting in the time and the hours into it, will be looking to test against those direct counters anyways. But that's kind of all of the points that I wanted to cover when it comes to this video. I feel like that is a lot of how I view a meta and how I analyze and try and counter a meta from there. And so I hope that was helpful for some of you guys. If any of you guys have any sort of points that you wanted to add, or any topics that you might want to debate about in the comments as well, or just showing how you might analyze a meta as well, I'd absolutely love to hear it. And I'd imagine that also people who are learning from this video a bit more would also love to hear different views on how to analyze and approach a meta in the comments as well. So I imagine that would be helpful to a lot of players, not just myself, to have a conversation about. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Hopefully this is a kind of video that I can do a bit more consistently in the future as well. Thank you guys for watching as always, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.